in some ways, this is if you're a game developer or a game design student, then we're the lucky ones in a way. I mean, this is a difficult time for everybody, and it's really challenging. But the world needs games. There's a lot of attention and energy that is flowing into games at this moment. People want more games, and I see that as an opportunity and a responsibility. So for the NYU Game Center, we're thinking about how to keep our project going and kind of live up to the challenges and the responsibilities of this moment. And so we're really excited to have the online version of this event series continue. We'd like to thank the people who make that possible, our sponsors, Fresh Planet, Take-Two Interactive, DOTS, and the Empire State Development, the NYU Game Center. And we are really excited to have Geoff here tonight, talk about his new book in conversation with Eric. So I'm gonna turn it over to Eric Zerman, part of the core faculty here at the NYU Game Center, and he's gonna moderate tonight's event. So welcome and have fun. Eric, take it away.
Thanks, Frank. And hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us online. I'm speaking to you from the East Village in Manhattan, actually near the main NYU campus. And I'm so happy to be introducing Geoff Engelstein tonight and talking with him a little bit about his book, Achievement Relocked, that is just out from MIT Press. A lot of us at the Game Center, we are game designers and game creators, but we are also scholars and academics, and we teach game design, and we have a kind of a certain balance of those sorts of activities. Geoff is interesting because in a lot of ways, he's almost like the sort of reverse of that. He is a working game designer. He's a very active tabletop designer and has been in the industry for more years than I'll mention here. And you might know his games like the Space Cadet series. Geoff worked recently on The Expanse, that sort of very large tabletop game based on that TV property. And also, we are excited to announce that Geoff has a new project that has just launched print and play and will be coming out on tabletop later this fall. And that is I want to make sure I get the name right. That is the Super Skill Pinball game, where you have actually translated a pinball look and feel and experience to a tabletop game. I have no idea what that's going to be like, but I'm really excited to try. But I mention all of that in the context of saying that Geoff is also not just a game designer, but he's kind of like the yin to the yang of us at the Game Center that are full-time academics and doing a lot of game design. Well, Geoff is really deep in the game industry, doing a lot of scholarship. He is one of the co-founders of the Ludology podcast, which you have not heard yet, is one of the, most amazingly deep and consistent places to get really rich dialogue and discourse about all kinds of game design, especially tabletop game design, but a fair about video games and all kinds of games as well. Geoff is also a prolific author, especially in recent years, of books about games. That you wrote Game Tech, which is a kind of a spin out of a lot of topics that came out of the Ludology podcast. Less than a year ago, I think, Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design came out. That is a monumental work that looks at all of the different elements of tabletop games and kind of breaks them down encyclopedia-like. In fact, I think it's kind of a badge of honor that Board Game Geek, that's sort of the one of the most prominent websites in the tabletop game universe, is now using your methodology, and I should say co-authored with Isaac Shalev, to organize the way that they talk about game design. So you're really having an impact there. Of course, we're here to talk about Achievement Relocked, which is your new book. from MIT Press, and you're going to talk about it, and then we're going to talk about it. So I don't want to spoil too much, but I will say that it's such a pleasure to read such a deep and careful and focused and insightful and incredibly readable book about a very narrow aspect of game design, which is really this psychological relationship that players have to loss aversion and failure and regret. And you're really like digging into these weird and interesting emotions. There's sort of like intellectual, emotional, psychological, social spaces that are so unique to games, and they kind of cross over between our sort of loose and hard to understand and squishy kind of animal minds and human relationships and emotions, but they're also quite mathematical at the same time, right? I mean, that's I think that you're probably going to get into this, but that the book really bridges the kind of mathematics and formal aspects of games with the sort of deeply felt psychological aspects of games. And it's just I think a brilliant and fascinating book. And before I hand Geoff off to you, the last thing I want to say is that Geoff, it's really a pleasure to have you as part of our community. Recently, I was, from time to time, I'll say I sit in on game design classes that some of our adjunct faculty teach, and Geoff teaches our board game design class. That day, you had set up all around the room a whole bunch of little tables, each table kind of showcasing a different game mechanic. And it was just it was a wonderful testament to your deep literacy of games, your kind of designer's knowledge of how they work, and also your kind of generous nature and wanting to share that with your students and these sort of budding young game designers. And I get that sense out of Achievement Relocked as well, that it's a tour of all of these different ways of thinking about games that you sort of tie up together for us. And I have to tell you that I still, from that one day visiting your class, there's still some nuggets that I have kept with me and reused. So I know you have a lot more to share tonight. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, help me in welcoming Geoff Engelstein. Thank you so much. It's great to have you here. My little one sound of clapping will suffice.
Okay, yeah, we'll have to do it. Thank you so much, Eric. I feel like we should just stop here because I feel like anything I say at this point is going to be a letdown from that introduction. But we'll see. Okay, I am going to try to share my screen here. Let's see if we can get that going.
So,
thanks everybody for coming. And
go ahead.
no, I was just going to thank everybody for coming. I know that this is not the best circumstances.
Geoff, you've invited me to interrupt you, by the way, during your presentation.
Yes.
So if that happens, I don't want anybody to think that I'm being rude. Geoff has asked me to kind of poke my head in. After Geoff talks and the two of us dialogue a little bit, then we're going to open it up for questions. So if you have questions, you can even start queuing up your questions now by typing them into the live stream chat area on YouTube where you're watching this.
Okay, and there it is, full screen mode. Got it. Bingo. And
that is my banner covering while we figure out.
Okay, I appreciate you covering while I figure out the technical stuff.
That's
so
okay.
Let's see. How are we doing?
All right, I think we're
shared. We good?
Go.
Okay. So thanks everybody for coming to this event. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to be just going through a handful of topics. I go through a bunch of topics about loss aversion in the book, and I'm just going to kind of go through a handful here to give you a flavor for what it is. But just as in terms of a basic definition of loss aversion, is that, if you're walking down the street and you find a $10 bill, you are happy. And if you are going and you find that you've lost $10, you get sad. But a fundamental part of human psychology is that the intensity of that feeling, the intensity of the positive feeling is not as much as the intensity of the negative feeling. You feel much worse about losing $10 than you feel good about gaining $10. And that fact spins into a whole bunch of different psychological aspects. And one of the things about game design, particularly tabletop game design, although video game design is the same way to a large extent, is that we don't have all the tools that we have available to somebody that's writing a novel or somebody that's making a movie. If you're a movie and you want to convey emotion, if you want to put the viewer into a certain emotional state of making them afraid or making them happy or making them excited or making them anxious. There's music, there's different ways that the film is shot, there's lighting, there's all kinds of things you can do in movies. And unfortunately with board games, video games, you can do music a little bit, but still, you're limited to the way the players interact, particularly because the players typically are kind of choosing their own path and going through it. So by understanding loss aversion, I find that it gives the designer another tool to kind of manipulate the player's emotional state, and maybe not guaranteed to get them into a specific state, but at least increase your chances of getting the experience that you want the players to have, which is so much of what game design is about. So before I jump into this, I just wanted to give a quick content warning. I actually have an example in here, which I have. This is part of this presentation, which I had back in February, early March. We were going to doing this, which is about involves a pandemic, but it's from a study in the 1980s that was done, and it's really useful information. So I don't want you, please don't think that I'm using this gratuitously. It was part of the foundational research, and I think it exhibits sort of an interesting point. So I just want to let everybody know that that's coming up, just in case that you wanted to drop off. So moving ahead, talking about loss aversion, it first came out from the research of Kahneman and Tversky in 1984. And ultimately, Kahneman actually won the Nobel Prize for this work that was done. And Tversky, unfortunately, had passed away by the time it was awarded, so didn't share with it. But it's been a fundamental to a lot of research and a lot of work in economics. I'm also going to be going about, like I talked about, you're manipulating players, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about some of the ways that we can talk about casinos, and we can talk about online games and free to play and things that use a lot of these techniques to manipulate it. So I would just ask that you use these techniques for good, and just to to kind of emotionally charge players and not just drain their wallets like some people have done. Okay, so let's just jump into example. Now, normally if we were face-to-face, I would be doing some surveys and asking for a show of hand on these things, but we're just gonna kind of go through, and if you can think about what you would answer.
I can be, Geoff, if you want, I could be your guinea pig. I know it's
okay. Well, it's more of a survey, so I guess we could get a survey of one. It's
okay.
not really a statistical sample, but
right.
We'll do the best we can.
Alexander King is rolling his eyes somewhere, who teaches math for game designers at the Game Center.
There you go. So let's say I presented you with two choices. Choice A was that I was guaranteed that you would get $3,000. And in choice B, you have an 80% chance to get $4,000 and a 20% chance to get nothing. And just to take a little bit of the math out of it, the expectation value, which is the average value, if you were to repeat this over and over, choice B is actually $3,200. And the question that people were asked was, which would they rather pick given those two choices?
Of course, I'm going to pick choice A, Geoff.
Okay, well, 80% of people pick choice A.
Right.
So there you go, Eric.
Especially if you're only going to give us one time. If you said we would pick it over and over again,
then maybe. Exactly, yeah. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. So let's talk about, and here's another set of two choices. Okay, now choice A, you're guaranteed to lose $3,000. But choice B is 80% chance to lose $4,000 or a 20% chance to lose $0. So how about now, Eric? What would you do?
I guess I'm switching my answer to choice C, because
hey, well, most people do.
Choosing a guaranteed loss just doesn't sit well in my belly. I'm really trying. I've read the book, but I'm really trying to give you my actual instinctual answers here. Sure.
So 72% of people choose B. So not as many as the one with the gains, but still most people gravitate towards B. And it's just, and another thing, keep in mind, I'm going to talk about a lot of these surveys. None of these surveys are 100%, right? There's always going to be people that go against type. So even though you use these techniques, they're never, quote unquote, foolproof. There's always going to be some variation in the way people react. Okay, so here's another one that was presented. And we're going to kind of summarize some rules off of these. So there's two different ones that were put in. Choice A, a 0.2% chance to win $3,000 and a 0.1% chance to win $6,000. What do you like on that one, Eric?
Well, I know too much from reading your book, but yeah. These very small numbers all feel the same to me. I'm going to go for the big win of 6,000.
Yeah. And with choice C and D, with a 0.2% chance to lose 3,000 and a 0.1% chance to lose 6,000. And again, all of these are mathematically the same. Choice A and B
Right.
are mathematically the same, and C
I
and
would
D are
much rather
mathematically the
lose
same.
3,000.
Most people's having a double chance of losing the $3,000,
Yes,
right?
that's the choice.
And that's the way it goes. So, you know, in this case, it's it kind of goes against it. You know, before with this one, you chose a chance to lose more, but here you're going to take a chance to lose less. So when you get to small percentages, things can kind of flip around a little bit. So a couple of, here you go, again, 73% are going to choose C, which was the one that you said. Okay, so again, this is going back to our first problem here with a 100% chance to get $3,000. So this is going to illustrate another rule that I'm going to summarize in a second here. So this was what it was before, 100% chance to get $3,000, 80% chance to get 4,000, 20% chance to get 0. Now there's another way of phrasing that, totally different numbers here, which is 100% chance to get 3,000, but now I'm giving you a 99.9% chance to get $4,000 and only a 0.1% chance to get 0. And still, even with this choice, most people take the $3,000 guaranteed. Even that just little sliver of chance, and you talked about regret as a key word, that's an important word when we're talking about this. A lot of this is around regret and people putting in alternate futures and saying, hey, what am I gonna, you know, what do the different futures look like? And, you know, we're not very good at judging those kind of small percentages. So we just see two futures, one where I have 4,000, one where I have 0. And you're like, you know, if I end up with this 0, I'm gonna be really upset. Mm-hmm. Way more upset than I'm gonna be that I got an extra $1,000 happy for the 4,000 versus the 3,000. And that all becomes because of that 100% chance to get 3,000. So these are kind of the 4 rules that we can use to analyze a lot of these situations. The first is that people will take a sure gain over a gamble for a bigger gain. The second one is that people will gamble to avoid a sure loss. So like we had before, you'll take that 80% chance of losing more money to have the chance of losing nothing. And people also tend to treat all small probabilities the same, and they just compare the gain and the loss. So when we had that 0.1% versus the 0.2%, people aren't really good at judging that. If you have 40% versus 80%, you know, people can deal with those kind of percentages. And 100% and 0% are special. If I give you a 100% chance of doing something and a 99.9% chance of doing something better, you may still take the 100% chance. It just looms large in our brains, the way that we're wired.
Jeff, you know, I don't want to jump in too much, and maybe we can return to this at the end, but
sure.
It just strikes me that this talk is so relevant to our current moment. In fact, it's actually hard for me to imagine a time when there has been more discussions of math, probability, flattening curves, and, you know, decreasing outcomes, increasing chances, decreasing probabilities, understanding what arrangements than in our present moment with the global pandemic happening now. It's really, it just strikes me that all of this is so, you know, is so interesting, the way that, like, even this idea that people understanding what it means to take a risk, gambling their chances by continuing to socialize, you know, because for them there's a small chance and small chances add up. And anyway, it's just, I think that we're going to return to this, but I want to footnote that because it's, you know, that
you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, there's a lot of, you know, part of it is psychological, part of it is just, you know, the challenge of math and conveying math to people with, you know, especially when you start getting into logarithmic and exponential stuff. I keep seeing these logarithmically scaled graphs in the New York Times, and it makes me very concerned that people have no idea what they're really looking at.
But the cool thing about your whole book and the talk that you're giving is that, you know, it's really it's the video game or the tabletop game. It's never just the rules that are out in the world, or the game on the table, or what's happening on the screen. The real game that's taking place is the game that's actually happening inside someone's head or in a conversational or social space between people. So the mathematics are always necessary, but never sufficient for really understanding what's going on in any kind of design problem, right? Mm-hmm. And as you say, it's about explaining math to people. It's almost less important the actual math, and what's more important is how people are understanding and digesting the math. And I think that that's why your book is so fascinating from a design point of view, because we're always already in the realm of this of the human and psychological. It's never just math. It's always how people interpret and understand events that happen to them in life. Anyway, I'll shut up and let's keep going.
No, that's good. Okay, so for just a quick case study on some loss aversion, I'm going to talk about the card game Hearthstone from Blizzard. And for those of you that are not familiar with it's basically a card game. You build a deck, you get 30 cards. If you run out of all your cards, then you start taking damage. But most games do not get that far. So that's just a little bit of preface. And here's a card from it called Tracking, which is you get to draw the top 3 cards from your deck. You look at them. You pick one that you want to keep, and the other ones are discarded and are out of the game forever. And this card causes a lot of people psychological anguish, especially when they're new to the game. It happens to be an incredibly powerful card, but for new people that are just approaching it and they read that and are like, oh my gosh, I got to throw away 2 cards and I look at 3. What if I pull 3 really good cards and I got to get rid of them? Here's some quotes that I pulled off of various forums. So you can see here, the first one is, I've disliked the idea of burning 2 cards to get a 3rd. If I put a card in my deck, it means I want to use it. And the bottom quote is, burn 2 other cards to draw one and possibly lose key parts of your deck. So this is this idea that you're losing something and you're forcing the players to lose something. Now, it's really good to, like I said, this card is actually really good because most of the time you're not going to draw through your whole deck anyway. So you can think about it as these are 2 cards you know you're not going to have, the ones you discard. So you can play around them. There's other things you can do. But just as an experiment, I put together this alternate effect for tracking, which is look at the top 3 cards of your deck. You get to keep 1 and you shuffle everything else, the other 2 back into your deck. Then you toss away the bottom 2 cards without looking at them. And when I've shown this to people, they typically, it's a lot wordier, and I apologize to Blizzard. If I was actually trying to make this a real card, we'd want to make it less wordy. But this is an effect that is a lot more psychologically appealing, especially to just new players that are coming to the game. You get to look at 3 cards, you get to keep 1 of them, the other 2 may still be available, and you're specifically discarding 2 cards from the bottom of your deck. And when you play that you're probably not going to get to the bottom of your deck, so you don't really feel like you're losing those cards as much. So again, just strictly from a strategy standpoint, this is a worse effect than the one that's really in the deck. But it makes people more comfortable when they're playing. It makes the new players less anxious when they're using this card. So it's just an example of the way the designer can manipulate the player state.
Yeah, you're really talking about the way that the game frames the math, right? The way the rule or the way the procedure is framed. It also reminds me of in World of Warcraft, when they launched, they had a mechanic to keep. Hold
that thought. We're going to talk about that later. Don't ruin me, man. That's a very good connection, though. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Okay, we're going to do another.
Yay.
Okay, and again, this is where we're coming into our disease thing. But again, I want to talk about emotion and the way this impacts emotion. So I think it's relevant. So this was a study that was done by Kahneman and Tversky. This was part of the first study that they did in 1984 to kind of analyze the way that people approach things. So this was a setup that they gave people. A deadly disease is rapidly spreading, and if nothing is done, 600 people will die. And then they gave people 2 choices. Choice A is that 200 people will be saved. And choice B is that there's a 1/3 chance that all 600 are saved, but a 2/3 chance that nobody is saved. And in this case, most people pick choice A, guaranteeing to save 200 people.
Thank you for not asking me to make that choice. I want to make that choice.
Yes. And then that was half the people got this question. And half the people got this second question. The setup is exactly the same. A deadly disease is rapidly spreading. If nothing is done, 600 people will die. And in this case, choice C was 400 people will die. And choice D is 1/3 chance that no one dies and a 2/3 chance that 600 die instead of the 400 die.
It just flipped, that's all.
And in this case, 78% of people chose choice D. Now, if you put all 4 choices together, and the mathematically savvy among you, most of you probably notice here, is that choices A and choice C are exactly the same. Because if 600 people are going to die and you say 200 people will be saved or 400 people will die, those are the same thing. And similarly, B and D are exactly the same thing. But when I teach this in my class or when I give this presentation for seminars and things, there's always people that pick A for the first one and D for the second one. And that is actually the most common combination that people pick. And this is something that's called framing. You know, what is a gain? What is a loss? So the way that you present your information to people is going to impact the choice that they make. And we talk about marketing. And even now, like you're talking about, Eric, yeah, that it's relevant. And what I want to talk about is that the way this is presented to people is so important in terms of policy, in terms of making decisions, in terms of how people approach it. You know, you've got saved, you've got die, right? 400 people will die. That's a real loaded term, right? That's a very emotional term that you're telling somebody, if you push this button here of choice C, 400 people will die. But if you push button D, there's a chance that nobody dies. And a 2/3 chance that 600 die, but 600 is pretty close to 400. So it sounds about the same, right? It's not as big a deal. And same thing between A and B, 200 people saved versus that chance you're looming large is that large chance that nobody will be saved. And so the emotional content is really coming into play here.
Yeah, I mean, this is where your work really connects with contexts, I think, outside of games. I mean, so much. When I was reading your book and I came across this example, it made me think about like the debate around healthcare. Just use a related example. You know, there's one side is saying, well, you're gonna lose your insurance, you're gonna lose your private insurance, you're gonna lose choice, right? If we go to a public healthcare option. And the other side is saying, no, we're going to gain healthcare for everybody. And they're using the exact same language of loss and gain that you use here. And it's really about, you know, how one is framing those issues, you know, and that form becomes the content and sort of generates opinions.
And losing something is almost always, you know, you're always better off pitching to somebody who has a politics or whatever. If you want somebody to you know, pick your choice, pitch it as something that's being gained, something that's being saved, not something that's being lost, as you talked about with healthcare.
Right. Or I mean, conversely, the politics of fear can motivate, right? This idea of losing something and of frightening people because of an outcome. I mean, what you said about imagining two futures, right? If I can convince you that one of those possible futures is so terrifying that you'll do anything to stop it, you may not be seeing the whole picture. And that happens in politics and policy.
Yeah, politics, marketing, all kinds of different things for sure. So let's again talk about framing and a practical example of that. So here's two games that I've done. So first I want to talk about this game Pit Crew. Pit Crew is a team-based game where you are, as it's a speed game, real-time game. You're as quickly as possible trying to play cards onto your race car to get it back out onto the track. You're playing the pit crew. You have to change the tires. You have to put gas in the tank. You have to fix the engine. And then you want to get it back out on the track as quickly as possible. I've got a little picture of the track here on the screen. And part of it is that you may make mistakes. You may make mistakes unintentionally just because you're scrambling and you're trying to go as fast as you can. Or you may make mistakes intentionally so you can get your car out on the track. As soon as you get on the track, you get to start rolling a die and moving around the track. And it puts pressure on the other teams to also get onto the track as quickly as they can and maybe force them to make mistakes. So mistakes was kind of a really critical part of the design. And the way it works is, as I said, so when everyone is quickly, simultaneously, each team is working in their car. When everyone is done working, then there's a pause, everyone stops, takes a deep breath, and you look at all the cars and see the mistakes that are made. And penalty points are awarded if you make a mistake. And the question was what we did with the penalty points. Now, initially what we did, because the racetrack is sort of a score track of sorts, is we actually would move the cars backwards on the track. If you got 3 penalty points, you'd have to move backwards 3 spaces. And what I found was when I was playtesting this thing, that especially it's aimed at families and younger kids, is that people were very shy about getting penalties. They wanted to really, you know, make sure they got it right. They didn't want to move backwards, and they were, you know, just playing more cautiously than I wanted them to. Part of the design is I wanted people to make mistakes. I wanted people to take that calculated gamble, to just, you know, not put that tire on as well, and figuring that they could move a couple extra spaces. But it wasn't achieving that desired effect. So I came up with an alternative, which was that if you get a penalty point, you don't move backwards, but all the other cars move forwards. Now, mathematically, that is exactly the same thing. There's no like end point. It's not like when somebody gets 10 moves, gets one lap on the track, they win. So mathematically, it's exactly the same.
And ergonomically, it's worse because you're moving more little pieces on the board.
Exactly. It's much more fiddly if you got,
yeah, more time. Yeah, exactly.
Yep. But when we tested it, it got the effect that I wanted. People were playing with much more abandon and were just going, and if they got a penalty point, you know, it moved the other cars up, but we're fine. You know, it didn't affect us as much. It really lifted the psychological burden of making mistakes and totally changed the way that people were playing it. So that's the rule that was in the final published version. And again, this was sort of aimed at that younger, more casual market. Whereas you mentioned the Expanse game, during the introduction, Eric. In this game, you earn victory points. It's a much more strategic game, and you're earning these victory points. And at certain points, you can spend victory points to purchase cards, to keep a card, but basically to kind of do special things you can do if you expend victory points. And it was right around the same time I was actually developing Pit Crew. So I looked at it both ways, and I found in this game, I wanted that decision to spend those victory points to do something to really weigh on you. I wanted it to be a very serious consideration. I wanted it to hurt. I didn't want you to just do it willy-nilly. So in this case, I did leave it as negative points. So you actually have to spend the point and your score marker moves backwards on the track, because I wanted that emotional heft. It's a longer game, a strategic game, and it just fit better with the overall milieu. So, you know, I want to emphasize that this is, you know, when I'm talking about this, you know, framing things one way or the other, it's not good or it's not bad, right? It's a tool that can be, you know, twisted one way or the other. You can turn the knob down to 0 or up to 10.
Right. I love these pair of examples, Geoff, because it just goes to show that in design, like in any creative endeavor, there are no magic bullets. There are no universal rules. And it's less about knowing the right thing to do and more about understanding your audience and the situation, the experience that you want to make. So I love it that these examples basically show that you took opposite approaches in two different situations for two different effects. I love that.
Yeah. Plus my publishers were excited because I got to plug the games in the book. So it really worked out well.
Nice.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about World of Warcraft. This was the example you were bringing up. So for those of you that play World of Warcraft, so there was originally when they were doing World of Warcraft, they were actually a little bit concerned that people were going to spend all day sitting in front of their computer, like they kind of did. So the initial system that they had was that as you were playing the game, the amount of experience that you earned would go down. So it would start to degrade. You'd have to do more and more to get the same amount of experience. And people were miserable. I bolded there that people just hated it. So before they released it, they went back to the drawing board. And those of you that played World of Warcraft know what they ended up with, was that they just flipped the presentation of this, right? So they flipped it so instead of a penalty for staying on too long, they gave you a bonus for not playing. And they called it the resting bonus. So as you rest, you accumulate this time. And when you go into the game, you earn 200% experience. And then if you play for a long time, your resting goes away and you go back down to 100%. And they just scaled all the experience that you needed for that. They just have, you know, doubled all the experience that you needed to achieve levels and everything else. And people love that. That just, you know, and that was one of the big kudos that Blizzard got when it came out with the system. And it was literally the exact same system that they had released in beta that people were miserable with. So I think this is a terrific example of that idea of framing and how you're presenting things to your player base.
It's true. This is why this example is so deep, Geoff, because it makes me realize pleasure and desire and pain and suffering, so much of that are really, I mean, those are real things that are in the world, but things like desire is something that exists inside of us as much as outside of us. And that it's really, yeah, it's just amazing the power that putting a conceptual frame or model around something completely changes our experience of what is objectively on a mathematical level the exact same numerical.
Right. And we get so obsessed sometimes with the design aspect, right? So, you know, the mechanisms, and we, and I wrote a whole book on mechanisms, right? Oh, the players aren't happy. Let me change the way the game works. Maybe you don't have to change the way the game works, right? Maybe you can just change the way it's presented, change the way that it's framed,
right?
And that can turn what was a negative for the players into a positive.
Right. I mean, it's the sense in which a game designer is like a party host as much as they are like a car engine mechanic, and it's about welcoming people in and making sure that they're having a good time, that they can find a comfortable place to sit, that they get a drink, they get their coat off their arm and get a drink in their hand as soon as possible, and all of that stuff. You can have two people can have the same exact go to the exact same party, and maybe one doesn't encounter the host and has a horrible time. So it's such an important part of game design. It's the human part of design. It's understanding that we're human, that our players are human, and that we need to design for that context.
Right, and that's one of the things I personally love about game design, is that it's so multidisciplinary. You need to know the math, you need to know the nuts and bolts, but you also need to understand the psychology as well. So, in the board game space, at least, this idea of kind of changing the presentation of games has really come a long way. Monopoly and Risk, which are still basically the staples of people growing up, for most of the people in this country, at least. The arc of Monopoly and Risk is you start with a little bit, you get a bunch more, and then all of it gets taken away from you, except for the winner. The winner is the only person that doesn't have that story. And that's a really tough story for people to take, especially if you're like 8 years old. It is not something that, fosters good feelings among people. And yet that idea of, starting with a little bit and building up and building up and building up and then losing it is like the worst possible psychology that you can have for people, if you want them to just sort of enjoy it. In the 90s, the European School of Board Game Design kind of came into forefront. And in that case, people were building, people were expanding. You almost always start with more than you end with more than you started with. So like Settlers of Catan, you're building, but once you have a town on the board or a road on the board, it never comes off. And that kind of was a different sort of aesthetic, where it was all about growth, and it's sort of more of a race. Everyone is expanding and growing and building, and you're just trying to get to the finish line at the last part. So it's been interesting to see how these kind of arcs have changed over the decades. So next thing I want to talk about briefly here is the endowment effect. And the idea is that once you give something to somebody, once you give something to a player, then they quote unquote have it. It's theirs, and they ascribe more value to it. It comes in a bunch of different guises in the real world: endowed progress, the sunk cost fallacy, holding your investments too long. Once you have something, it's yours. So I want to talk a little bit about one big aspect of this with the game Wizardry from 1981, which was a staple of ours when we were in college. We played a ton of Wizardry, high school and college, 1981. And this was actually one of the first, if not the first person style dungeon crawl game. I actually showed you a little forward view. It's pretty nifty to try it now if you haven't had the opportunity with an emulator. But there was creatures in it called Night Stalkers that drained your characters a level. And it was the absolute worst thing in the game. You could deal with dying and then you could resurrect or something like that. There's things you could do it, but there was no remediation from getting drained a level. You just had to get the level back again. I personally still have chills over losing levels in Wizardry. And Wizardry was really a spin-off from Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons came out in the 70s, and level draining was a part of D&D. So when Wizardry came out, it was a part of Wizardry. And just here's some quotes I pulled out about level draining in D&D. The one in bold is underline is my favorite there. There's little you can do in D&D to viscerally terrify players, but for whatever reason, level draining does it. And it's this idea again of giving levels, and with a level, you don't just get the level, you get new skills, you get new toys, you get things you can play with. And then when you lose it, all that goes away. It's just a terrible, terrible feeling. And interestingly, in Dungeons and Dragons, over the years, they have stepped away from this as they've kind of changed the audience and it's gone to a broader audience. So in AD&D, Advanced D&D, which was first edition, second edition, level draining was out there. It was an undead ability and you could not save. Then when third edition came out, there was a saving roll that you could allow, but if it failed, you still lost a level. And then finally in fourth edition, they completely eliminated level draining and it has stayed eliminated to this day. Now, interestingly, after fourth edition, which was not super popular and well received, not because of the level draining, but for other reasons, there was a movement to go back to D&D 3 or 3.5, and a game came out called Pathfinder, which was basically an adaptation of the third edition Dungeons and Dragons rules. And Pathfinder, one of the few things that they changed from third edition was eliminating level draining completely. So it's just been interesting to see how that has been so backed off of. So again, when Dungeons and Dragons was first born, level draining was in there and there was nothing you could do about it. You got hit by a vampire, that was it. And gradually it's just been dialed down, dialed down, dialed down. And, you know, again, to make it an easier psychological experience for the players. I mean, there's still a lot of stuff you can do in D&D psychologically, but that really hit at people's heart when they lost levels.
I think it's interesting because levels really represent, I mean, you had sunk investment, they really represent time. Mm-hmm. And I think that time on the clock, time in your life, that's like one of the things that has one foot in the game world and one foot in your real life that never stops. When you're spending time playing a game, you're also spending that exact same amount of time in your life doing something, right? So in a funny way, the idea that I'm knocked back on a progress, I'm knocked back in my level, things are being taken away from me. And the only way to get them back is to kind of spend the time to move forward again. That there is something visceral about that. Yeah. And it's not only kind of a lost labor sort of feeling, but it's also this, I think it's because it slices so close to reality. You feel as if it's almost as if something is reaching out from the game and taking a piece of your actual lived reality, and suddenly it's vanished.
Yep. Yeah. In fact, the last quote on this page here is, but what I've always liked about level drain is just how personal that loss can be, as if part of the character's life truly was ripped away forever, lessening them for it. So that's that same idea. But yeah, and I think it's interesting when you see different approaches to this in video games, because the question is, if you die in a video game, what does it do to you, right? Most games will set you back a little bit or something, but there's always a judgment call about how far back do you set people. And that's like what separates hardcore games from fluffier games. But as a designer, you're constantly kind of judging that. I mean, I basically gave up on Super Hot VR at one point because I hit one level, and there was, in Super Hot VR, you have to get through like 4 or 5 little vignettes before you get to a checkpoint. And I kept getting to the 5th one, and I kept dying, and it kept sending me back to the first one again. And the other ones were not so easy either. So, you know, eventually I just gave up, and, you know, I kind of see that as a design flaw. I didn't see the rest of the game just because I had to keep redoing that content. It kept stripping it away from me. Okay, so again, just to summarize, giving something to a player and taking it away is you're playing with fire, so do it carefully. If you may be better off never giving it to someone in the first place. But I want to talk a little bit about a real positive way, kind of, that this idea is used of the endowment effect by taking a closer look at Portal. It's from 2007. I'm going to spoil Portal here a little bit, I guess. It's okay. So on the off chance you haven't played Portal, here's a little fair warning to bail out. Mute your screen during this period. It's okay. It's a dozen years ago. I think we can give. Yeah, it was safe. Okay, so there's a level in Portal which became which is called the companion cube level. So in Portal, there are all of these cubes, and the blue cube on the left-hand side of your screen there is the one that's always that you see, and you have to put it on buttons, and you can use it to stand on or whatever. There's all kinds of different things you can do with the cube. And they vaporize all the time. If you carry them through to try to carry them to different levels, they'll vaporize. The designers came up with an idea of they wanted to have one level where you'd actually have to carry a cube with you all the way through to the end of the level. And ultimately became what's called the companion cube level. You can see that cube is over here with the heart on it on the right-hand side. Now it's an interesting story because initially they didn't have it. It was just a regular cube when they first did a level. And when they were testing it, people just kept forgetting to bring the cube with them. They would leave it behind and they would get to the end and they couldn't get out, or they get to a point where they needed the cube and they couldn't get through. And it was a big problem. So they're like, you know, we got to make sure that people remember to carry this cube. So they went through a couple of different things. They put the heart on it. They put and they put in dialogue that tried to make you more attached to the cube. And here's some of that dialogue. So this was, when it first comes out, there's a computer voice called GLaDOS. And so the first thing it says here is the vital apparatus stand will deliver the weighted companion cube in 3, 2, 1. This companion cube will accompany you through the test chamber. Please take care of it. It's right there what it says. And then later on, a couple of minutes later, it says that just be careful about superstitions. You can say you can perceive inanimate objects as alive and hallucinations. The Enrichment Center reminds you that the weighted companion cube will never threaten to stab you and in fact cannot speak. In the event that the weighted companion cube does speak, the Enrichment Center urges you to disregard its advice. So they're doing a couple of things here. First, you know, they're trying to be funny and they're trying to, you know, this is the computer's kind of crazy and they're trying to build the character of the computer. But at the same time, they're trying to build this narrative that the cube is, it never comes alive or anything, but it is endowed to you. It is given to you. It is a pet. It is something that you have to take care of. They want, the designers are deliberately trying to form an emotional bond between you and the cube. And as I said, originally they were doing that because they just wanted you to remember to carry it through and not be frustrated. What they found was that they succeeded so well that it gave them the opportunity to put in the twist that happens at the end of the level. And this is the spoiler part. So as you can do this. But
you know, also everybody dies in Macbeth. I don't know if you're aware.
Oh, jeez. There you go. So at the end, you have to throw the cube into the this pit, the incinerator, and get rid of it. It has nothing to do with the level, right? It's not. It doesn't have anything to do with the physicality of the game, which you play the game. It's just an emotional beat for you and the computer in terms of the computer being cruel and inhuman, and just to kind of force you to reckon with this. Now you've become really attached to this cube, and it's not that long. It's like a 10-minute level. You've got to throw it in here. And they found that people really did it. A lot of people really delayed and tried to do whatever they could, and there was just no way around it. You have to throw this cube in there. And they create, that's also helps create animosity between you and the computer. It's one of the first things where you start, you know, really hating that computer, forcing you to incinerate the cube. And in spite of the fact that it was in only this one level out of like 23 levels or something in Portal, the companion cube was by far the breakout character of that game. There's companion cube plushies, there's companion cube toys, there's the companion cube was prominently featured in the comic book that came out later. There was many more companion cubes in the second game. It was so memorable because of this idea of endowing it and creating this, endowing it to the player and creating this emotional pet-like bond to it. So I just think it's really interesting they did it.
Yeah, you know, it's the interesting thing about the companion cube is that it's, I mean, there's actually lots of levels of things going on there. Definitely, it's like a metaphor for the way that our desire attaches to things, right? That we, as you write about in the book, that we get attached to things, that this thing which otherwise would have been meaningless, just we don't want to let it go. And the proof of that is the kind of the celebrity of the companion cube outside the game. But I think the amazing thing is that what Portal does with that is it also doesn't shy away from saying this is also total artifice, right? It's not there. It's not really illusionistic. This whole sequence takes place in a game which is a a story where you are a rat in a maze. You are a human being manipulated by computers. And I think what's so funny is that that we can still take pleasure and we can still feel emotion, even as we're aware of the mechanisms that are manipulating us. That doesn't make them disappear and be invisible. In some ways, and in some contexts, it can amplify their effect. And I guess what I love about this is that this is kind of what games are. You know, games are, as Frank has said, I've seen him speak before, that games are a way that kind of thought becomes sensible to itself. That it's almost like you participate in your own manipulation in a funny way in a game, because you have so much agency in this interactive medium. And so I don't know, to me it's very beautiful the way that this example comes out in your book, because it's not just about you got something and you lost it, but it's the whole way that it's framed within the story and the experience of the player. It's such a perfect encapsulation of the way that one is already aware of all this manipulation when you're playing a game, but it still is so impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. Every game designer should study this example and play through it. It's got so many little subtle touches that are done by the designers to get you to the emotional point at the end that you reach. Absolutely. So here's a game idea. I'm just throwing this one out for free. I haven't done this one yet, but a pick up and deliver game where you get paid in advance for your contracts. Most pick up and deliver games, when you deliver the cargo, then you get the money and you can use it. I was thinking about designing a game where when you take the contract, you get the money for the contract. But if you don't finish the contract within a certain number of turns or a certain amount of time, then your money gets stripped away from you again.
No!
I think it would be a much different emotional journey for the players, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like, how would they narrativize that in something like Crazy Taxi? Your customer would like rob you, take the money back and run if you didn't get them there on time.
Sure. Okay, one last example, and then we can take some questions here. Talking about endowed progress, this is one of my favorite studies from the book. So this was done in 2006 by Nunes and Drez, and they worked with a car wash, and they gave out 2 different types of coupons at the car wash. So half the people got the first ticket there, which had 8 holes to be punched. And if you went to a car wash 8 times, then you got a free car wash. Then the other half of the people got a 10 punch ticket, but 2 of the holes were already punched. They got 2 starter punches, and people were explaining that they were running a special promotion where they punched 2 holes. So both cases, people had to go back to the car wash 8 more times in order to get the free car wash. And then they sat back and looked at how many of these were redeemed. And what they found that of the 8, the completely unpunched one, 19% were redeemed, but almost twice as many of the ones with the 2 starter punches were ultimately completed, which is, I find, just sort of a staggering result. And they call this endowed progress. And the idea is that once you are already started along a path, that you feel invested in it. And if you stop doing the path, you have a little more of a psychological twinge than if you never get started on it at all. So basically, they were afraid to lose those 2 starter punches. They feel like they already had some skin in the game. So how can you use this in games? Well, the Settlers of Catan actually used it almost exactly the same way. For those of you that know Catan, you're trying to get 10 victory points to win. But when the game starts, you already have 2. You start with 2 towns on the board, and each town is worth 1 point. So it's actually precisely analogous with the car wash example of needing to get 10 punches, but having 2 punched already. You really only need to get 8 more points in Catan. So you already have an example, already have started down the road to winning.
It's surprisingly close to the actual research.
Yes, the car wash study was after Catan, so I've been meaning to try to reach out to the researchers to see if they were inspired by that at all or what that meant.
That's awesome.
But this leads me to and this is the last thought I'll have on for this presentation.
Science imitates art. Sorry.
Yeah, is what I call staggered goal engagement theory. And one of the the video game Civilization, Sid Meier's Civilization, always has this reputation of being like, I just want to take one more turn. I just want to take one more turn, that it's super addictive. And one of the reasons I feel about this is directly related to this endowed progress effect. So when you're playing Civilization, right, you're doing a whole bunch of different things at the same time. You're moving a unit around the map. You're building a new granary, I have in this example. You're researching technology. You're building a wonder. You've got all of these different things going on. And most of the time, when you finish a task, when you like finish building that warrior, you're only like 1 or 2 turns away from finishing something else. Things take like 10 or 20 turns, but there's so many different things going on that there's always another thing that you're really close to ending. And that's what creates that psychology of you wanting to play just one more turn. You never reach a point in Civilization where all of your projects are done and you're just completely starting with a fresh slate. There's always stuff that's in progress. There's always something that's moving you down the road. Now, I have played board games and even computer games where you're like, maybe you're trying to buy some special card, right? And you need a set of resources to buy that card. And you play the game and you have to collect all those resources. And then finally, when you get them all, you cash them all in, you get the card, and now you've got no resources and you've got to decide the next target that you're getting. And it's a bit of a letdown. I think psychologically, it's a missed opportunity. I think you'd be much better off in a board game or really any type of game, at least having people go after 2 cards at the same time, so that when they're done getting card 1, they're still left with some stuff, and then they can go after card 2 and just make it easier to facilitate that. So I think wherever possible, you never want to have your players totally complete a goal and have nothing to move on to. You want them to be in a situation where they never don't have a plan. And again, you talk about like MMOs with the questing systems and stuff like that. There's usually some goal that's hanging out there.
Right. It almost has the feeling of like the titillation of foreplay or something in a sexual context, where you're sort of stroking desire and it's you don't want to reach a kind of closure. You want to keep moving forward.
Okay. I'm just going to leave that metaphor there. I'm not going to go any further into that one.
Yeah.
So that's basically it. So there's a lot of different, I just tried to talk about some of the things relating to loss aversion from the book. There's a bunch more in there. Just in your daily life, I find that just being aware of these psychological tendencies is incredibly helpful towards getting around them. There's plenty of people, like stockbrokers don't hold positions too long typically just because they do it every day, right? There's things that you can do and you can understand what you're doing. So if you're aware of these different characteristics, you can use them, and you can definitely use them to your advantage as part of your designs. So I guess with that, I can stop sharing.
That's great, Geoff. Thank you so much. I'm giving you all the applause.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
That you would be getting if we
You're
were
an army of one.
Yeah, sharing a room together. Well, I'm the avatar for the audience now. But that's what a great little tour through all those mechanisms in your book. I because I told you to be careful what you wish for, because I kept on butting in during your talk and dialoguing with you. Maybe we should just go straight to some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we covered a lot of the stuff on that. Yeah.
So our friends at the Game Center are posting some of the questions from the live stream chat. So I'm going to take. I'll start with one of these questions, which says, "You just wrote a book detailing every mechanic you could think of. What made you choose this particular one to dive into so deep within one book?"
Okay, well, first off, I would say we thought of a lot of mechanics that were not in the book. I'll just say that. We made no attempt to be exhaustive. So in the mechanism book, there's going to be more to come, but so I don't want to say that we did that. But loss aversion is actually not even in the book because I don't consider it a mechanism, right? It's more of a technique that can be used in a wide variety. Now, certain mechanisms may be more prone to, having people feel lost, like losing a turn and player elimination, and some of the other mechanisms that we have in there are more prone to these feelings of loss aversion.
I see.
But so I don't feel that it is.
For you, a mechanism is more of a kind of a low-lying.
Yeah, it's a lower level.
Right. That gives rise to something like loss aversion. But to channel the question a little bit more, what did attract you to it then? Because of all of the kind of phenomena you could write about relative to games.
So I started doing I do a little 5-minute segment about math and science and psychology on this podcast called the Dice Tower. I do a segment called Game Tech. That's just 5 minutes out of a 1-hour show. And I started doing, psychology periodically. I do these little psychological things, and I was doing a lot of this stuff separately. I did a little thing on the Endowment Effect. I did a little thing over here, right? And then I started doing more reading and researching more deeply, because I really enjoy that kind of, psychology and psychological aspects, and realized that they're all the same thing, really. That all of these little disparate tentacles are all tied together in this root of loss aversion. And I was, as I started researching it more and more, it just became deeper and deeper and deeper. I mean, they have found aspects of loss aversion in animals. They've done experiments with chimpanzees, and they exhibit the same behavior that we do in terms of this stuff. So it's wired really deeply, and it spirals off into so many different directions. So that's why I just keep finding it a bottomless pit of different impacts and different features and things like that.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I'm gonna defend my sexual metaphor as not being gratuitous, but I just not that you felt. I'm anticipating all of the snarky commentary online, but I think that when we're talking about the way that human beings think, and we're talking about topics like desire and pleasure and emotions and psychology, it does reach into things like our fear of death, right? And loss, and into things like the forms of pleasure that we feel when we have physical pleasure, when we eat foods that we like. So I know it might have come off as goofy, but I guess what I want to do is really draw connections between what you're thinking and the ways that people behave and feel.
Yeah, no, and drawing those kind of connections is fantastic. I always love that, seeing two different things and realizing that, if you go down 1 or 2 levels, they're coming from the same place. It's a very powerful concept.
Okay, we have more questions. Let's keep on going. Here's there's a couple of questions that get a little bit more detailed. Let's see. You mentioned examples from your designs in the context of a family game versus a strategy game. I guess the Pit Crew versus the Expanse. Yep. Is loss aversion in gaming something that scales down as players get more experienced and more strategic? So would you, I guess someone is looking for the way that people relate to loss aversion somewhere along those scales of more casual to hardcore or more family to strategic games?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in terms of the first approach, I think that, you can, I think that what the question asker may be asking is about repetition and stuff like that. If I'm going to play a game 100 times, does the trick still work? And I think the answer is no. With all this stuff, if as you get repetition, then you start to not feel it the same way. An experiment was recently done. So one of the things I suggested, I was talking on Game Tech one time about, there's a game called Ink and Gold, or Diamante, which is a push your luck game where you're exploring a cave and you're trying to get treasure. And each turn, the only decision you have is whether you stay in the cave to try to go deeper and get more treasure, or whether you run out and lock in all the treasure that you have. And if at any point the cave collapses and you're still in it, then you lose all the treasure that you've collected. And I had speculated that, that the theme would potentially affect the way that the players played the game. In terms of loss and stuff like that. So for example, with you being, an Indiana Jones type, it's kind of structured around greed. You're trying to get treasure, you're trying to get idols, you're trying to get artifacts. If you themed it around firefighters going into a burning house to save people, and if they didn't turn out and, the house collapsed and everybody died, but, or did they go in, and that people would approach it in a different psychological way. Wow. And a couple of years after I talked about that, a researcher at the University of Tampa actually got a grant to do the study, and did it. And he actually did 3 different versions. He did the firefighter version, the artifact version, and he did just a purely themeless version with just points. People were just getting points. And he had people play hundreds of games with the different themes. And he did see that there was a difference in the way people played with the themes, that as expected, people tended to stay longer in the house or the cave. They stayed longer with the firefighter scenario, was the one where they stayed in the longest. The treasure was the second longest. And the themeless they tended to run away the most and just bank their points.
Interesting.
However, and that was interesting, but then they had people play it like 5 times with the same theme. They only had one person just play with the same theme. And what they found out, it was by the time people were on their 4th or 5th game, that all of those differences between the 3 different themes went away.
Wow.
The amount of time that people, the number of turns on average that people stayed playing the game was the same regardless of the theme. So the theme affected people initially, but once they started playing it repeatedly, and again, this was like 3 or 4 times right in a row and sitting in front of a computer, the theme fell away and they just were focusing on the mechanics and what they needed to do to win, which I just thought was a fascinating result. And I'm sure it's the same thing with loss aversion. We talked about stockbrokers. If you're trading stocks all day, it's the same thing. If you're playing poker all the time, losing a pot isn't as big a deal as it is if you just play occasionally. So yeah, I think repetition will tend to strip away a lot of the psychological impact of this stuff.
It really makes me think about whether games can be a source of training ourselves to resist psychological manipulation, right?
Well, I think it can be. Like I said, just awareness of these tricks, when you're reading ads and stuff like that can just be good with that. Or casinos, what casinos and slot machines do, if you study the techniques of what they do, it's insidious. By the way, that research was done by Dr. Stephen Blessing, in case you want to look him up. So thanks to Dr. Blessing for doing that.
Right. So the question is there's a certain fork that happens where one kind of gains a critical consciousness, whether you're aware of it or not, where the metaphor gets stripped away. But sometimes we're kind of sucked in and it becomes addiction, right? And that's a whole different relationship to a game.
Right. Yeah.
We're not being aware that we're manipulated, and we're not kind of training ourselves to be more critically self-aware. So yeah, it's complicated. I guess if we had the answers to all these questions, then we wouldn't need games at all. So there's some wonderfully detailed questions here. Maybe I'll dive in. So one wanted to ask you about in regards to the level drain in D&D. So they're asking about, in video games, how cool would it be if, I guess, in a game like Wizardry that you mentioned, the video game told you how much game time that level represented? Are there moments where you see games kind of celebrating the amount of time that you're losing, or I guess when you finish up, that kind of happens in your discussion of permadeath in video games.
Yeah. I think that's, it would be interesting if it told you, hey, I'm setting you back this amount of time. I mean, that just seems like it's kind of taunting the player in a way. And I know, like, once these games become addictive, or you get really into a game, like my son, I've been with him where he goes in and Steam shows you, when you go into your Steam library, it says you've played this game for 397 hours, and he's like, why are you showing me that? I don't want to see that statistic.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's a way of, making it more quantifiable to the player of what they've invested in the game and what they're really giving up if they go back a couple of levels or whatever to a different point.
We have a few more coming in, and I think we want to end by 8:30. So we'll take a few more questions. And so if you have more questions online, feel free to send them in there. Thanks to Logan and Gwenna and Dylan, who are keeping things going on the back end. This one is really about auction mechanics. It says, in a game context, does loss aversion impact not just how people feel or make decisions, but the way people price things they bid on in auction style mechanics? Are there any relevant examples? Does that bring anything to mind for you, Geoff?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think that, auctions are a lot about sort of that idea of endowment or possession or something like that. People get caught up in the moment because they feel like once they bid on something and they're the lead bidder, there's a little bit of emotional attachment to that. It's like, oh, I could win this thing, right? And I think that when all of a sudden somebody challenges that you start to get defensive, and it triggers that same idea of, I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose this item. So there's a lot of, and that's another thing in terms of the way that an auction is structured, of how you manipulate it. in terms of design. Like if you have an open bidding auction where it goes up versus where you have like a game where you've got your bid in the fist and you just put some coins in the fist and reveal it. It also matters if you lose every bid, you know, if you do a sealed bid, if everybody loses their bid or just the winner loses their bid, of how you approach things and how you value things. But I have also seen games, and I'm escaping, it's escaping me what it is, but I've seen games where, you know, something is in essence owned by somebody and it kind of goes up for auction. But it starts kind of belonging to a certain player, but it still is going up for auction to all the players. And definitely when I've seen those cases, the person who owns it, who has it, will always tend to overvalue it. They will not let it go as cheaply as they should, even though they could get a substitute someplace else just because it's theirs. So I think if you wanted to maximize that idea of, you know, endowment and people having it in an auction, I would structure it so it's kind of everyone's got something that's theirs, and they still have to kind of, they get to use it for a turn and then they have to put it up for auction. I think that would make it interesting.
So interesting. Yeah, it gets a great example of framing in the sense of possession. I'm being told that this is a comment from Jesse Fuchs. It may be a comment more than a question, but let's hear what he has to say. Jesse says, I feel like, Jesse, one of our faculty and also game designer, I feel like learning to treat health as a resource is a low-level heuristic. I learn over and over again every time I play some new game with such a system. So I guess he's talking about the way that games create economies like health, that you know, at the beginning you feel that it's part of your body and it's about dying and not dying, and then you realize, wait a second, it's an economy, that you sort of go through the process of unlearning the narrative framework around it, like you mentioned with the Inca Gold games.
Right. And yeah, and that's a whole other lecture and topic, is about the idea of using tropes in game design as a way of getting the player involved and into it as quickly as possible, right? And health is one of those, right? We all know what health is. We've all, you know, if I give you a game that's got a red health bar and a blue mana bar, right, you know, there's just certain expectations that you're bringing to the game. If I give you a dwarf in your party and an elf in your party, there's certain things you're bringing to the game. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of you know, managing those things, then we start with just that generalized concept, and then as we get more into the game, then you're like, oh, okay, you know, it's real easy to recharge my health in this game, so I'm not going to worry about it as much, or it's like, oh, this is a super valuable commodity, I better guard it literally with my life. Like I just started playing Path of Exile next to my son, and you know, that health is very easy to come by, right? So you don't need to worry about it. It's a very different sort of a thing than some games where it's just, you just get worn down.
Yeah, I was just playing Overland, which is a strategy game where I think every character just has 2 health, and you really cling to them.
It really hits home. Yeah.
I
remember, you know, that's starting the early days of D, when I started playing D&D in the 70s, and your wizard had 1 hit point. You roll that 1d4 and it's like, okay, I got 1 hit point, here we go.
Right. No re-rolling, no average. Speaking of this kind of the hardness or harshness of games, someone is asking the question, do you have any tips for game creators who want to soften the blow if their design for some reason requires players to suffer losses during the game?
It's going to really be very contextual, but in what it is. But if it's, you know, I think if it's presented, it depends. Like you could present it in a humorous way, you know, or that it's, you know, it's, and that tends to, you know, just bring it from a different, it's not as serious. It's the seriousness a lot of times that can do it. But if it's presented jokingly, or if you lose things in crazy ways, you know, that can sometimes, you know, undercut the loss aversion aspects. You want to make sure people don't get, you know, make it more abstract, you know, and just so a couple of examples just from the world of casinos, which is one of my favorite topics, right? Casinos are in the business of overcoming loss aversion, right? That's their goal in life, is to make it easy for you to bet your money and not worry, not be upset at losing it, and say, hey, wow, that was fun losing my money. I'm going to go back to Vegas next year.
Right.
And they use a couple of tricks. And one of them is converting your money into chips. That's a big one, right? There, a lot of these endowment effect and loss aversion studies show, like, if I give you a mug or a chocolate bar, you will ascribe much more value to that than if I give you tokens and say at the end of the experiment, you can cash these tokens in for a mug or a chocolate bar. You'll be much more free with tokens than you will with the actual physical object. So by actually forcing you to cash in for chips, that's one way that they soften the blow, because the chips have less intrinsic meaning to you because they're so abstract. They also will, of course, let you exchange money to chips while you're sitting at the table. But if you want to change chips back to money, you got to walk across the casino to another corner and wait online at the cashier. There's just all kinds of different tricks that they do to kind of make it so that it doesn't feel as bad. So if you're looking to soften your game, I would just take a trip to your local casino and see what they're doing.
I love that example, Geoff, because that's another example of kind of intentional game design by the casino in this case that really touches on and intersects with the real world. I mean,
yep.
You know, as Mackenzie Wark writes about in A Hacker Manifesto, capital itself is kind of like the first major abstraction that happened, or one of the first big abstractions that happened in human civilization. That, you know, the idea of abstracting value, as you do when you talk about utility in your book, into currency, into money. Money already is a kind of fiction that allows us to externalize desire and feel detached from things, and you know, sets up messed up systems like contemporary hypercapitalism and things like that. So it's, yeah, again, it's so interesting for me to connect these very detailed ideas in your book to you know, contemporary kind of socioeconomic reality.
Right, and casinos also do, which a lot of video games do now too, is like when you go to a slot machine, right, and you put in $10, it gives you points. It just shows points on the display. It doesn't show you dollars. And how many free-to-play games do you cash real money in for some arbitrary currency? And it's always very confusing and obscured about what the value of that really is.
Right.
And you always have some left over also. It's usually designed so you can never pay exact change for something. You're going to be left with a couple of gems. And that goes back to that endowed progress idea. Well, I've already got 5 gems and this is only 20. So I'm already on the way, right? So that's some of the negative uses, or Riot, you know, League of Legends with Riot points and all that stuff.
Right. And I mean, and things like all these, you know, Xbox points and League of Legends points and Nintendo Switch credits, and I mean, it's there's a blurry line between those game artificial economies and things like Venmo and credit cards and, you know, our digital bank accounts. I mean, all of these ideas about value and our relationship to it, who has it and who doesn't have it, we're kind of steeped in that culture right now, where we're moving in a place where our relationship to value and currency and money is becoming more and more abstracted and more manipulated too by the people who hold a lot of it.
Yep. So yeah, so to kind of undercut the loss aversion, I would say, you know, if you can, you know, humor always helps, and if you can use abstractions, that also helps separate the emotion out of it.
Wow. See, Geoff, this is why you're such a pro, because you brought us right back to the question, making sure that we end up with a precise answer. That's amazing. Thank you. Well, I would ask the audience if you have any final thoughts or comments or questions for Geoff. Now is the time, because we're nearing the last one. I think that there's one more question up here that I wanted to pass on to you, Geoff, and after that we might be time to say goodbye.
Sure.
So let's see. This says, compared to other behavioral psychology concepts, do you think loss aversion is more relevant to game design? How relevant are topics like biases? And then they mention confirmation, availability, halo, or system 1 and 2. Do you know what they mean by system 1 and 2?
Yeah, system 1 and 2, that's also from Kahneman. That's the I forget which is which, but one of them is more the quick response, like snap judgment system, and the other one is the more deliberative system.
Right. So you mentioned biases a moment ago, but I think that they're talking about, connections to other kind of big psychological concepts.
Yeah, I think a lot of those are, I mean, I think that there's definitely other ways that people make mistakes in what they do, you know, in confirmation bias and a lot of, and some of those other things you talked about. And, you know, I personally find that loss aversion, I feel is one of the more useful ones for game design, just because it's so much more tied into emotion. I think, you know, confirmation bias and, you know, recency bias and some of those other ones that have been developed all are incredibly valid, and they're fascinating to read about and to recognize in yourself. But I find that those are more argumentative type things where you're trying to persuade somebody into a certain position or things like that. And some of them are appealing to emotion, but it's not necessarily putting the player into an emotional state, which is kind of what I've been focusing on. But yeah, I would certainly encourage people to read those other things. And especially the System 1, System 2 stuff is fantastic. A phenomenal book. If you haven't read it, is called Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, which came out a couple of years ago. So I would highly recommend that book.
Excellent. All right, I'm gonna end with one more question from the peanut gallery, which is what's your next book? Are you working on writing anything new these days?
I am actually working on a new book, but I'm not quite prepared to talk about what it's about yet. So I'll be revealing that soon.
Oh wow, that is that you're really thinking now.
But I am working on another game. I guess I can talk about it. So I'm working on another book about game design, but this one is more. It's a totally different aspect of it, which is the physicality of actually, like, how do you make a prototype? How do you prepare files for production? How do you use a rotary cutter? How do you make tokens? How do you make cards? How do you make standees? How do you make miniatures? And also touching on graphic design, rules writing, everything except mechanisms. So it's all those other pieces, because board game design is very physical activity. So I guess it would be the equivalent of like, a how to program book for a video game designer. So it's not about, ultimately what the video game does. It's about the core of like, how do you program, how do you get the computer to do what you want it to do.
Wow.
That should be coming out hopefully before the end of the year.
That sounds great, Geoff, and it's so generous of you to share your deep wells of knowledge. I was imagining when you almost didn't answer the question about the book, and you did. You were picturing two future Geoffs. One of
no, it's just one future Geoff, which is writing the book. For all the time I was spending in the house the last few weeks, I've done way less writing than I pictured future Geoff would be doing.
I see, but you're not the future Geoff that didn't share.
That's right.
The audience.
This is the future Geoff that's not writing, but telling everybody about the book. So now he's obligated to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's your sunk investment right there. So now you have no choice. But we can't wait to see that book. And Geoff, it's been a great presentation and conversation with you.
Hold up the book again. Here's the book, Achievement Relocked.
Beautiful.
With this spiffy cover. So
yeah, we talked about your design processes and your thinking about design, but we also talked about politics and desire and economics and all kinds of topics. And I think that it's really a testament to the relevance of your ideas and the depth of them and detail that's in that book. So it's really a pleasure, and I highly recommend it for those that make games or just want to know more about them.
Thanks. I appreciate the invitation to come on. It's been great.
All right. Well, everybody watching, I'm sure you will join me in thanking Geoff Engelstein for joining us tonight. Thank you, all of you that came out to join us online here at the NYU Game Center and our first ever remote-only lecture series event. So there will be more. Go to gamecenter.nyu.edu. I believe that is the URL.
Yeah, and I think Elizabeth Hargrave, if I saw correctly, is coming up very soon, and she's fantastic. So she's the designer of Wingspan, the board game. So.
Yeah, we've got great events coming up this spring, and thanks everybody. Thanks to Frank for being out and helping introduce, and to Gwyna and Dylan and Logan. Good night, everybody, and thanks again, Geoff.
Thank you.